So even calling him Harold Dahl's boss isn't correct. This is the ship registration of the North Queen. I don't know if you can see it or not, but the name listed here for the North Queen's registration is Dahl. So here you have to wonder why Dahl felt compelled to explain the damage to his own boat to Fred Chrisman. Or is it Harold Dahl's boat? The registration actually says Haldor Dahl on Union Avenue. You might expect this information to be conducted on official records like this, either at the time or fudged later in order to obscure things. You might just dismiss this as a typo or a mistake, just as in the comic book, but that's what I did. But since that time, a researcher has pointed out that Haldor Dahl and Harold Dahl may actually be different people because there was a Harold Dahl that lived on North Grove, and a Haldor Dahl lived on a completely different street, North Union. So the North Queen, by the way, was a 1942 fishing boat that was converted into a minesweeper for World War II, and then reconverted into a fishing vessel after the war. Some reports call it a decrepit old piece of junk, but it was actually not very old, a ship that saw military service and one that had just been reconditioned. Also, a year after the Maury Island incident in 1948, the registration passed to someone named Anderson in Tacoma. Yeah. And so we begin to submerge into this murky paper trail, which is something that would characterize Chrisman's entire life. Fudged and inaccurate documents, some of questionable provenance, some containing very intriguing pieces of information and disinformation. But his involvement with the Maury Island saucer story really begins 2 days after Dahl's. As Dahl had expected, according to the story, Chrisman thought that he and his crew had been drunk and when they saw this saucer stuff. But since Dahl had samples of the slag as proof and said that there was much more of the stuff along the shore, Chrisman decided to go and take a look. He later said that he did indeed see an enormous amount of white and black material there at Maury Island. But as he was looking it over, he had his own sighting. It was a donut-shaped craft, like the one Dahl described, but different in that it had no squashed look. It was convex, not concave. It did have an inner tube type structure though, and the portals, and it had this spinning little black thing on the inside bottom. And this was a very brief encounter, according to Chrisman, but scary enough. He said before he took off running, he supposedly collected more samples of both the black and the white substance. So where did Fred Chrisman come from? His earliest appearance in the historic record is from 2 years before the Maury Island case. It comes in the form of an extensive quote in Harper's Magazine in September 1946 in an article about the first post-war World Convention of Science Fiction Fans, the preceding march in New York. Interestingly, the article entitled Little Superman, What Now? Was written by William S. Baring Gould, whose grandfather, Sabine Baring Gould, was the English clergyman who wrote Onward Christian Soldiers. He also wrote 2 books, one on ghosts and one on werewolves. Okay, that led to an angry response from Chrisman that originally appeared in the May 1947 issue of a science fiction pulp magazine called Amazing Stories. This was 1 month before Maury Island. In it, Chrisman complained that the article in Harper's about the science fiction fans amounted to nothing more than a bunch of armchair philosophizing about science fiction concepts that he considered to be a very real phenomenon. And this had nothing to do with flying saucers. Flying saucers and the UFO craze in America were still a month in the future. The imagery of advanced aircraft had been around for a long time. The Flash Gordon serials of the 30s, for instance, had various rocket-type ships, and science fiction itself was a very long and interesting history in print, on radio, and in various movies. And UFOs of all shapes and stripes have been around since the dawn of man. But the imagery of the flying saucers as a recurring popular culture motif began only in the late 1940s, just after the first modern wave of sightings, and with the help of pulp magazines like this one, Fate. Actually, there are copies, they're giving away copies of Fate, still exist outside. This is the first issue of Fate, however, published in 1948 by the same person who published Chrisman's angry response in Harper's Magazine. Anybody know who that person was? Anybody? Ray Palmer. Yeah. Science fiction fans would argue that Ray Palmer's place in their history is not one of great respect. Even one of his associate editors told a pulp magazine historian that Palmer published, quote, some of the sickest crap I've ever run into. Palmer was a man of diminutive stature who helped popularize and promote the idea of flying saucers in his many pulp magazines. Amazing Stories, the magazine that more or less introduced Fred Chrisman to the world, was one of those pulp magazines. Actually, in the 1990s, Steven Spielberg once did a television version of Amazing Stories, using the title and the same kind of pulp magazine format. Palmer's publishing career continued until his death in the late 1970s, and among the last things he ever did was a magazine for the National Space Institute, a group of space industry insiders founded by the paperclip Nazi scientist Werner von Braun. And the significance of that will come in later in the lecture. Oh, did I get this right? No, I never did fix this one. Damn. Okay, this is a shot of Palmer. It shows what a small guy Palmer was, especially next to this guy who was a regular giant. And that's what's wrong with this slide, is that he's standing in the full slide. He's standing next to Richard Shaver, who was a real giant of a man. And Shaver, before 1948, Palmer was able to more than double the circulation of his various magazines by introducing the supposedly true stories of Richard Shaver. I really wish we had the photo of Shaver here. About a mysterious race of beings known as the Deros. The Deros were an underground alien race that looked very much like the little grays that seem to be so common these days among people who claim to have been abducted. If there is some sort of connection there, it does kind of expose the myth that such creatures are the creation of the modern media, because you get these little gray creatures called the Deros coming out as early as 1948. Shaver and Palmer insisted that the Deros were real, despite the fact that the original information about them was channeled to Richard Shaver through the welding equipment where he worked in a steel mill in Bartow, Pennsylvania. In addition to being alien creatures that inhabited caverns deep under the earth, Shaver claimed that all Earth men in part are Deros because they are being affected by detrimental energy streams in the post-atomic world. The word Deros is a contraction of the words detrimental and robot. And really a lot of what the Shaver mystery stories reflected was kind of this post-war alienation and the fear of being in a deadly technological situation after the bomb, fear of radiation, fear of mutation, and so forth. The interest in these stories was so great that it not only greatly increased the circulation of Ray Palmer's magazines, but it led many of its readers to write in with their own stories about their encounters with the Deros. And I should mention too that George Filer today, early this morning, was talking about the Greys, and there is this perception that the Greys, in fact, are robots or part robots. So even that part of the lore continues on. Fred Chrisman was one such reader, though, of Amazing Stories. After that long quote that appeared about, from Harper's Magazine, Chrisman's second appearance on the scene came in the form of that letter to Amazing Stories, and in it, Chrisman claimed to have encountered the Deros in Burma. He even described a wound to his arm that was the size of a pinhole, a description that sounded very eerily like he was shot by a laser. And this was years before the laser was even invented. Okay, now forget all of that, what I just said. That's what Ray Palmer did. Let's go back to the main story of Maury Island. Harold Dahl and company have had their encounter, and Chrisman went down the next day and supposedly had his. Now we can assume that Chrisman put this in a letter to Palmer as he had his encounters with the Deros. Although that's not really clear. There's no letter to that effect. What is clear is that Ray Palmer hired this man, and we all know who this is, right? Oh, come on, guys. Kenneth Arnold. This is Kenneth Arnold, yes.
But to be inventor of the term flying saucer.
No. He didn't invent the term at all. What is clear is that Ray Palmer hired this man to investigate the Maury Island claims. His sightings, Kenneth Arnold's sightings, happened 3 days after Maury Island, which started the first post-World War II wave of UFO sightings. Palmer read about Arnold's sighting in the newspaper and wrote to him asking for details, and Arnold sent back to him a copy of the report that he made about it to the Air Force. Okay, well, so I guess I better do the basics of Kenneth Arnold's story. He saw 9 chevron-shaped craft while flying around Mount Rainier in Washington on June 24th, 1947. I'm sure you should all know the story. Shame on you that you don't. And I will try not to go into too many of the details as your memories return to you. After this initial contact with Arnold, Ray Palmer wrote back and offered him $200 to investigate the Maury Island incident. And Arnold took on the assignment. In the course of this, however, Palmer never once mentioned to him anything about his past encounters with Chrisman. Okay, as I said, he forgot about it. He totally forgot, or he quote forgot about it. And in this story, this was the first instance in which Chrisman's presence on the scene was telegraphed in advance, but he was never told that he was a principal player. So in other words, Palmer is hiring Arnold to investigate Chrisman, but he's not telling Arnold that he knows who Chrisman is because Chrisman had written his stories about the Deros. To Arnold, Chrisman is a complete stranger to Palmer, and Palmer never tells him different. Okay, this is actually a postcard that I bought at the Tourist Museum near the top of Mount Rainier, which is actually part of the Cascade Mountains, Mount Rainier. It's a pretty spectacular picture, I think, and it shows, what it's showing here is lenticular cloud formations that often happen up there around the mountain. Actually, many UFO skeptics make the case that a lot of UFO sightings are actually sightings of these things, these lenticular clouds. And I'm not sure if that's what official tourism is trying to say here up on Mount Rainier, but this doesn't look anything like what Kenneth Arnold saw, and it certainly doesn't come close to anything matching either Arnold's description or the Maury Island description. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the pilot Thomas Mantell is the one most often referred to as the first UFO casualty in the post-war wave, and I suggested that the Maury Island dog might actually have had that distinction before Mantell. There are actually 32 other possibilities. These are the 32 Marines that crashed into this site at Mount Rainier. Arnold was actually investigating a crash of a C-47 transport plane from the previous December because it was a big mystery that had happened and what had happened to it and its occupants, 32 Marines. Arnold was a bounty hunter, and when he was looking for the $5,000 reward that had been posted to find the remains, and that's when he had his own sighting. So he's out there looking for these 32 Marines who crashed, and that's when he encountered the chevrons. The official cause of this crash became simply that it had veered off course, but if you take the position as I do, that official conclusions most often contains elements of spin control and cover-up, it's not too much of a leap to suggest that these 32 people died as a result of an encounter with a saucer, maybe even a damaging one that required the kind of repair maneuver that we saw at Maury Island. In any event, only small pieces of the wreckage and the tattered remains of one Marine uniform were ever recovered from this. Arnold's sighting, which involved 9 UFOs, 8 of them semicircular and 1 of them crescent-shaped, began this enormous wave of UFO sightings that happened in the late 1940s. In the East Oregonian newspaper alone, which is the newspaper of record in that part of the world, 17 UFO sightings were reported in the month following Kenneth Arnold's. And nationally, there were many, many cases. More often than not, these saucers fit more the description of the Maury Island saucers than Kenneth Arnold's chevrons. And of course, there were more than just sightings. There were a number of recoveries of different things. And here's a sketch of one of them. This 30-inch saucer discovered by a housewife that month and turned over to the FBI. The newspaper described it as a gold-plated on one side, silver on the other, the same colors basically as the Maury Island craft. Although it was later declared that this was built by some young pranksters using parts of an old phonograph, that only came after very strange actions by the authorities. Army intelligence officers were called in, and the thing was locked in the back room, and all were instructed not to say a word about it. And it's kind of hard to imagine that this was a response to something that looked obviously like it was pieced together from an old record player. Oddly enough, the size and shape of this 30-inch saucer matched a second and lesser-known sighting by Kenneth Arnold. Okay, this is the man to whom this 2.5-foot disc was turned over. If he looks a little like Ed Asner to you, pat yourself on the back, because Asner actually played this man in Oliver Stone's movie about JFK. This is Guy Bannister. He was SAC, that is Special Agent in Charge of the FBI in the Pacific Northwest in the late 1940s, specifically Idaho and Montana, at the time of the Maury Island case in Washington. Oliver Stone's interest in him begins about another decade and a half into his life. In the 1950s, Bannister testified before the Louisiana Joint Legislative Committee that at the time of the Maury Island events, he was actually working in counterespionage. That's from Bannister's own testimony. So this is a newspaper description of whatever it was that Bannister was given. During that same testimony to the Louisiana state body, Bannister described the saucer as a Japanese fugo balloon. The chief value of this statement is that it exposes the lie about the 4 boys rearranging parts of a record player. I'm sure everyone is familiar with the fugo balloon theory. Actually, I'm not so sure anymore. It has been offered up as one of the many explanations for what happened at Roswell. And in that case, as in this case, it has been almost totally debunked since the fugo balloons were launched from Japan in March of 1945, and the possibility of them remaining aloft for such a long period of time is remote. The Louisiana testimony included Banner's acknowledgement that he also was a coordinate for a right-wing militia group called the Minutemen, which is the only right-wing group that the Warren Commission investigated. But all that is getting ahead of the story. As I said, Palmer hired Kenneth Arnold to investigate the claims of Chrisman and Dahl for $200. Arnold went out to what was become the infamous Lennard Western Winthrop Hotel, room 503. The first thing to make it infamous was the fact that the room had already been reserved for Arnold by persons unknown. And this is a shot of the Winthrop that I took relatively recently. It still exists, but now it's been converted to rent control housing. It is here, after acquiring the room from person or persons unknown, that Arnold first called Harold Dahl by looking him up in the phone book. A very reluctant Dahl kept trying to talk Arnold out of his investigation, but eventually agreed to come over and also agreed to take Arnold to the storage site of the debris he had recovered from Maury Island. When he brought a chunk of it out, Arnold declared that it was just a piece of lava rock and actually started using it as an ashtray. Fred Chrisman showed up at the Winthrop the next day and went over the Maury Island story again with Arnold. He also told him of his flight experience and his missions over Burma during the war, although he mentioned nothing about the Deros. After Chrisman had his say, Arnold suggested that they all go down to Maury Island. Then Arnold had another brilliant idea. Bring in Emil Smith. Emil Smith was an airline captain who had publicly, well, now we're back in the Winthrop, who had publicly derided Kenneth Arnold about the Mount Rainier experiences, but then had a UFO encounter of his own. Arnold had met him through a military intelligence officer named Paul Weiland, who among other things, had been a judge at the Nuremberg trials, who had previously paid Arnold actually to go on a fishing trip with him. And the relationship of these two men, Paul Weiland and Kenneth Arnold, remains very unclear. But we do know that at one point, Weiland gave Arnold a .32 automatic that Arnold had on him at the Winthrop. So that kind of gives you the sense of the kind of paranoid atmosphere going on here. When Emil Smith arrived at the Winthrop and met Chrisman and Dahl, they recounted Maury Island again and agreed to meet at the island the next day with more samples of the UFO slag. And Chrisman volunteered to drive Smith on a long trip to Seattle and back to recover his things. So there's this kind of mysterious trip of Chrisman and Smith together. Before Arnold went to sleep that night, before Arnold and Smith both went to sleep that night, they received a call from a reporter named Ted Morello. And instead of asking for information, as you might expect a reporter would do, Morello actually repeated back to them the precise details of the conversations they had had with Chrisman and Dahl. So the room had been bugged. All four men made it out to Maury Island the next day. Chrisman and Dahl both brought more samples of the slag. They had to come back to the Winthrop, though, because the dry dock had been closed and there was no access. So Arnold filmed all of this. And in 1977, he mentioned that all of his film equipment had been stolen in a break-in. But the fate of all the film that he took that day is still kind of unclear. After that, Arnold decided to call in the Air Force. Chrisman was all excited about the idea, but Dahl refused to talk to anyone from military intelligence. So actually the picture of Dahl didn't want to say anything to anybody, and there were reasons for that. But they kept pulling the story out of him. But then he resisted again when Arnold suggested that they take it to the Air Force. Nevertheless, through his connection with this Paul Weiland character, two Air Force investigators, Captain William Lee Davidson and First Lieutenant Mercer Brown, came to the Winthrop Hotel. So here we are back to the comic book and everything that it has wrong. Says here that Arnold coined the term flying saucers. I heard somebody trying to repeat that bit, but that distinction actually belongs to a newspaper reporter named Bill Baguette. And of course, this identifies him as Harbor Patrolman again. Nevertheless, it is in this weird atmosphere of intrigue at the Winthrop and blurred details, some film and some pieces of the Maury Island slag came into the hands of military investigators. So, I don't know, how are we doing on time? How long have I spoken? Too long. Okay, well, I mean, that's a good cue, because I really would like to take a break at this point. This is all lead up to the second part, so let me just leave the story at this point, take a little bit of a break, and then we'll resume the story again from the point of the Davidson and Brown investigation. 10 minutes? 20 minutes? Okay, now Tim, I'm going to have to walk over there by the TV monitor before too long. And I'm going to trip over your tripod. Yeah.
Go anywhere you want to.
Oh, so that's hooked up to Tim. I didn't know that one was coming over. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me? Can I stand this far away from the microphone and still be heard?
You got to tip it up a little bit.
How about that? Can you hear me now? Okay. This is Lieutenant Frank Brown. He was one of two men the Air Force sent out at the behest of Kenneth Arnold to investigate the Maury Island claims of Chrisman and Dahl. His partner was William Davidson. Well, I didn't have to point.
Your left click on that.
Yeah.
The changes I made.
Can you lower the intensity of the light?
It just showed the
A
time.
little bit.
The intensity of this light?
Yeah.
Tom?
It's too brilliant on the screen.
Yeah.
Yes, isn't it making a weird?
Yeah, it's blinking on and off.
Yeah. Can we dim it a little bit?
Yes, there's a setting for that.
No, I guess no, stay right where
I would have to get the.
Looking good. How about everybody else? Yeah. Okay. Okay, where was I? Lieutenant, wait a minute, that's not even him. There. Lieutenant Frank Brown. Again, one of two men that the Air Force sent out at the request of Kenneth Arnold to investigate Chrisman and Dahl's claims about what happened at Maury Island. This is a photo of Brown that comes from a recovered ID, and in a minute I'll tell you what it was recovered from. There's the ID. Here's another shot of Brown while he was in Italy. Unfortunately, that and the previous one is all that really exists of photo documentation of Brown, which is like 2 photographs more than photograph documentation we have of Davidson. There are no photographs of him that I could find anyway. So Kenneth Arnold calls in these 2 Air Force investigators, Brown and Davidson of the 4th Air Force A2 Intelligence Unit, to be precise. He knew them because they had previously investigated Arnold himself after the Mount Rainier sighting, and Arnold had cooperated with that investigation and had turned over the many letters that he had received from people after his sighting had hit the newspapers. They expressed a particular interest in the letter that he had received from Ray Palmer. So he thought that they would be the logical people to call to look into this more. Dahl, who again was extremely reluctant to talk about this Maury Island experience at all, let alone to military intelligence, nevertheless repeated the story one more time. Chrisman offered details about the white debris looking like aluminum that make it sound a lot like the material that was recovered from Roswell. And despite the fact that Arnold apparently took the initiative to contact Davidson and Brown, in point of fact, the 2 were on assignment to collect as much information as possible during that summer wave of UFOs. They had been dispatched by a guy named General Carl Petui Spatz. Petui was his nickname. A commander who had served in Italy during the war as part of Project Ultra, a decryption project in Italy very similar to the Magic decryption project in Japan. And I think that's very interesting that these 2 secret decoding projects have names that are so similar to MK Ultra and Majestic, Ultra and Magic. Both, and if you don't know MK Ultra or the Majestic, these secret programs, then we have to talk. Let's see. Spatz provided Davidson and Brown with a B-25 to hop around and collect all this information, particularly on cases that involved recoveries of material. And so that explains their particular interest in the Ray Palmer letter. They were to report to Air Force Technical Intelligence Command at Wright Field in Patterson. According to an FBI memo from August of '47, Spatz, Brown, and Davidson in turn then reported to General Nathan Twining at Wright Pat. Now, the significance of this command structure comes in the form of something called the Cutler-Twining memo. Boy, where am I? The Cutler-Twining memo is an MJ-12 document that still resides at the National Archives. I have actually held this thing in my hand. Of all the MJ-12 documents, I believe that the CT memo, in combination with another one just recently found in a completely different archives, whose dates match up perfectly to the Cutler-Twining, comprises basically the smoking gun proof of the existence of MJ-12. Now, I know that's all very complicated, and it is it would be the subject of another lecture. I'm just telling you that in the National Archives there is smoking gun proof that this group, MJ-12, which you hear about all the time, actually exists, and you can prove its authenticity by comparing it to another document. This story that I'm telling you now, though, is complicated enough, and if you want to find out more about the color twining memo and something called the Lou Douglas memo, this article is in the latest issue of Steam Shovel Press, and I think I still have a few copies of that out there. Okay, let's go back to Harold Dahl. It was not for no reason that Dahl kvetched at telling his story again to anyone. After he first began talking to people about it, Dahl had an experience that later became repeated often with many UFO witnesses and became quite well known. Anybody know what that experience might be? He was visited by men in black, yes, men in black. This guy dressed in black, and he had a black Buick. I don't know if its dashboard shined. But when he met up with Dahl, he also demonstrated that he had a very detailed knowledge of Dahl's Maury Island experience. And he told Dahl that if he ever let the Maury Island story out, bad things would start happening to him and his family. And sure enough, shortly thereafter, Dahl lost a large number of logs he had salvaged from the bay, severely damaging his business. His wife fell deathly ill, and his son Charles, the guy who had his arm injured at Maury Island, disappeared. Charles was eventually found bussing tables somewhere with total amnesia about how he got there. And the where is obscured by FBI memos with conflicting reports about whether he was found in a place called Lust, Montana, or a place called Lusk, Wyoming. So all that kind of fits the Men in Black, the weird Men in Black weirdness that happens when the Men in Black come along. All of this happened before the meetings at Winthrop Hotel. So here again, the comic book misleads us. There were some other odd anomalies about the phone calls to the hotel. When Arnold first called Brown, for instance, Brown refused to accept the call on the military line, and he called Arnold back on a payphone. Moments later, the UPI guy, Ted Morello, called again, demonstrating that he knew all about the military investigators coming in. And then at some point, Dahl did indeed leave the scene and left the explaining to Fred Chrisman. So Dahl is all pretty fed up. But the biggest thing that Brown and Davidson took from their investigation was the recovered debris. Depending on who you read, they had either a trunk of the material, both the black and the white material, or a Kellogg's cornflakes box full of it. Chrisman gave it to them. And Arnold noted that it was different. The material that Chrisman gave to them was different from what he had used to turn into an ashtray. And at 1 a.m. the next day, Davidson and Brown died in the crash of their B-25. Okay. How did it crash? It went down in flames. I know that much. Here's another problem with some of the details. Because I've sold out the books, I don't have the book to refer to. But the how of it is explained in there. Of course, it was widely reported. What wasn't reported much is that the counterintelligence team sent out to do cleanup at the crash site, which was supposedly unsuccessful in finding any evidence of the Maury Island debris, recommended that all similar incidents in the future be handled by the Foreign Technologies Desk of the Air Force, which is something that George Filer mentioned again this morning, and something well known to people who've read Phil Corso, who claimed that it was the Foreign Technologies Desk was where we kind of doled out the technological benefits of recovering the Roswell crash.
Did they find out who were the two guys that parachuted out to safety?
There were, well, yeah, there was a
There was a crew chief and a young hitchhiking sergeant.
There's a crew chief and a young hitchhiking sergeant.
Very good.
Yeah. But I'll tell you what, like I said, I've got this Best of Steam Shovel, which will be a big question and answer thing too. So instead of trying to fill in all the details as I go along, why don't we just hold the questions to the end? What was I saying here? Oh yeah, okay, Arnold. So Arnold and Smith, after all of this, after Davidson and Brown died, Arnold and Emil Smith opted out. Quite freaked out that the investigation had led to the deaths of two military personnel. After Davidson and Brown died, the pair met with another Air Force intelligence officer, a guy named Colonel Sander, who tried to convince him that the UFO material was nothing but slag from a Tacoma smelter.
Be checking down.
But I wasn't going to say that. But who nevertheless refused to let either keep even a single piece of the slag. So this is very similar to Roswell, where Jesse Marcel's son, who should have been allowed to keep the debris if it wasn't really a weather balloon. So here you got the clampdown going on. Emil Smith retired to Florida, where he still lives, as far as I know, although I'm still doing my best to kind of track him down. Arnold went on to more fame with his own sighting. In fact, he became a national celebrity and gave lectures at UFO conferences across the country for many years. Although the Maury Island story appears in his book, The Coming of the Saucers, it does not comprise really a big part of the story he told and retold at the lecture circuit. Here's a photograph of Arnold from 1962, running as a Republican for the Lieutenant Governor's Office of Idaho, obviously shaking hands with Dwight Eisenhower. So the only further public record of Harold Dahl is that he continued to live in Tacoma, once subletting a house to a typewriter rental office, and once operating a gun shop with a federal export license, and he sold antique furniture. The log business never took off after that encounter with the Men in Black, and Harold Dahl died in 1980. Even though Fred Chrisman had died 5 years earlier, the course of his life took on far more dramatic turns than Harold Dahl. Okay, this is one of the MJ-12 documents that the Woods have surfaced. We know Robert and Ryan Wood. Yeah. I can't speak about the authenticity or the provenance again of this document, but it is interesting in what it says at the bottom. After recapping the Davidson-Brown crash, it reports that the material given to Davidson and Brown was believed to come from Maury Island and may be celestial fragments containing metal from a nuclear reactor from a UFO. The fragments were turned over to CIA agent Clay Shaw, and Chrisman was ordered to the Alaskan ADC for assignment in Project IVI. Chrisman then did indeed go to Alaska after all the events of Maury Island, and he was also reactivated for military service, like a lot of people in the Korean War. He's a World War II veteran and reactivated for Korea. So it does make reference then to this CIA agent Clay Shaw. This is Clay Shaw, played by Tommy Lee Jones, actually, in the JFK movie. He was one of 3 people that New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison attempted to indict as part of a conspiracy in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. One of the others, Edgar Eugene Bradley, was refused extradition from the state of California, where he lived, by then Governor Ronald Reagan. Although Shaw was exonerated in Garrison's famous trial, a poll of the jurors said they believed that Shaw had worked for the CIA or something like it. In the late 1970s, a former CIA operative named Victor Marchetti verified that Shaw was indeed on the CIA payroll. This is a document from the National Archives that supposedly demonstrates that Clay Shaw was in the U.S. at the time of Wernher von Braun's surrender. Is it exculpatory of his involvement? Or was Shaw handling things from the U.S. side? Again, this is a reference to Wernher von Braun. As I said previously, Ray Palmer actually was involved with this publication that was part of von Braun's group, the L5 Society. Shaw's historic record has had a number of curious things done to it, including volumes of Who's Who having been wiped clean of his connection to Permindex and the Centro Mondial Comercial, which are 2 international agencies in something called the Torbit document these things are mentioned prominently there. Again, these references exist in earlier volumes of Who's Who and are gone after 1963. So take it for what it's worth. In the official documentary record of Clay Shaw, you do have a pattern of the record going back and being changed. Again, as I said, Shaw is mentioned prominently in something called the Torbit document. The Torbit document is a famous bit of underground information that circulated photocopy to photocopy until it was finally collected for the first time in a book that I put together called NASA, Nazis, and JFK. The Torbert document claims that Shaw played a large part in managing the surrender of Wernher von Braun, one of the Nazi rocket scientists who helped build the American space program. The Torbert document fits this information into the background of the JFK assassination. In fact, the book includes a photo of JFK conferring with von Braun just days before the assassination. Now, Jim Garrison supposedly first became interested in Chrisman after receiving this letter anonymously. And this was supplied to me by an FBI guy whose specialty is the Robert Kennedy assassination, a guy named Bill Turner. It claims that Chrisman was the first man Clay Shaw called after finding out that Garrison was pursuing him. It also claims that Chrisman was responsible for the disappearance of $2,000 intended to pay assassins among the anti-Castro Cubans in Florida to assassinate Fidel Castro. Listed among Chrisman's associates was Sergio Arcasas Smith, a man Garrison did eventually try to extradite from Texas in connection to his role in something called the Cuban Democratic Revolutionary Front, what Garrison considered a CIA front group for the assassination. The second most famous member of the group was David Ferry, the albino pilot friend of Lee Harvey Oswald. The most famous member of the group was Oswald himself, who worked its propaganda arm called the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Some of this might be familiar to you from the JFK movie. But Oswald operated that propaganda wing from an office in New Orleans that doubled as a private investigator's office for a man named Guy Bannister. But Garrison knew Guy Bannister in the 1940s. You remember Bannister now from the earlier part of the lecture. He was an FBI special agent in charge who recovered the 30-inch disc near the time of the Maury Island case. Jim Garrison says in his autobiography that he knew Bannister well and often had lunch with him to talk about what was happening, the trade stories, you know, shoot the shit kind of thing. Surely Bannister mentioned that. Surely Bannister must have mentioned to Garrison about the 30-inch saucer. Did either man have knowledge of Maury Island, and did they discuss that? Certainly there was some buzz going around about it in the FBI, and parts of it were appearing in the newspapers. And yet Garrison seems to know nothing of Chrisman in 1968. It's another instance, just as with Ray Palmer, that Chrisman's presence should have been telegraphed ahead, but it wasn't. Again, if you're too young to remember this history, you'll have to hearken all the way back to Oliver Stone's movie JFK. Chrisman doesn't appear in it, but Kevin Costner does a good job of going over the more visible aspects of Garrison's investigation. As Garrison's investigation of Chrisman continued, he discovered that Chrisman had several undercover lives, including being a minister in a number of right-wing churches and militia groups. This is the ID for his ministry in the Universal Life Church, a group that I understand still sells divinity degrees in the classified ads in the backs of various newspapers. The Warren Commission itself had actually investigated one such group. I mentioned it earlier, the Minutemen. The Warren Commission never looked into Chrisman himself, but this group, the Minutemen, included as its chaplain a man named Reverend Bob Leroy, who still practices his ministry and publishes a newspaper, The Alarming Cry, out of Langley, Washington. The interesting thing about Leroy is that he claims that his now deceased brother Barney witnessed the original Maury Island saucer encounter from a few hundred feet down along the shore. And yet when Garrison announced his interest in Chrisman, he said that it was in connection not to these right-wing groups, but to Chrisman's undercover work as, quote, that part of the warfare industry engaged in the manufacture of what is termed, in military language, hardware, meaning those weapons sold to the U.S. government that are uniquely large and expensive. In other words, according to Garrison, Chrisman was an industrial spy and, as we go along, presumably also an assassin. And so through Garrison and through the many other files that have emerged through the Freedom of Information Act, we find that Fred Chrisman, at the very least, had a multifaceted life. One document, I was talking to Ben about this, called the Easy Papers, outlines a lifelong career in covert services for Chrisman, starting with the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, where he presumably would have met Clay Shaw, and ending with his involvement with the local politics of Tacoma, Washington. By this account, considered by some to actually have been written by Chrisman himself, Chrisman is an agent of something called the 4250 ECE division of the CIA. And that document makes no reference at all to Maury Island. Here is his Social Security application, wherein Chrisman claims only to be employed by Warner Brothers. So much later in life, Chrisman would claim that the old Roy Thinnis show, do you remember The Invaders? Yeah. He said that that was actually patterned after his life. But this here is an early indication that Chrisman may have worked as an actor in some capacity in the entertainment business. And these CIA references constantly appear in Chrisman's own personal legend. Here is some stationery for something called and you can't tell it from the stationery, but you can tell it from the, if you could read this, something called the Civic Improvement Alliance, the CIA. Chrisman did in fact run for several local political offices in Tacoma and served on the board of directors of the local library. Chrisman also became an early version of Rush Limbaugh, doing a right-wing talk show on Tacoma's KAYE radio. And because of this, he said that leftists tried to assassinate him in 1968. These are the bullet holes in his car over here. Over here is the arrest record of the night that he got the bullet holes. Of course, the person arrested was Chrisman himself for driving recklessly, disorderly conduct, and resisting arrest that night. There are persistent stories that he hung around also with the gay S&M scene in Tacoma, and that this might explain his relationship to Harold Dahl. During the period of the late 1960s, Chrisman also made a few appearances at UFO conferences and corresponded with two well-known UFO researchers, Gary Leslie and Lucius Farish. Bill, I hope you know those names. All of that correspondence can be found in the Maury Island book, if you can find the Maury Island book. And it is interesting that Chrisman basically claims that, for all intents and purposes, he and Dahl are actually the same person. Okay, so while you're thinking of all that, let's take a closer look at what Chrisman's possible involvement in the Kennedy assassination looked like. This photograph first appeared in the Torbit document. I guess some of you have seen it. So I've got it reproduced in NASA Nazis and JFK. By the way, I've got I got lots of copies of NASA Nazis and JFK. This is, of course, a photograph of 3 alleged hobos, or tramps, or whatever you want to call them, bums, that were arrested in the rail yard behind the grassy knoll in Dealey Plaza on November 11th, 1963. Here's a more close-up look. Notice that... get this thing working. Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. Let's see. Notice that despite the fact that these 3 may have been involved in the assassination of the president, the police guards both have their guns relaxed and pointing down kind of casually. Also, these tramps are surprisingly well dressed for tramps. Jim Garrison actually took this photo onto the Johnny Carson show. Johnny Carson actually devoted one of his programs to an interview with Jim Garrison, and it was really the first exposure of this photograph to the world at large. And like a lot of Johnny Carson's shows, his archives have disappeared and you can't get a video of it, but we do have an audio of the entire show, and Steam Shovel makes it available on CD. Uh-oh. Okay, these 3 have been identified as various people by various researchers. One famous accusation is that 2 of them are Watergate burglars, Frank Sturgis and E. Howard Hunt. Another candidate is Charles Harrelson, the father of Woody Harrelson. There are even official arrest records for them, One of them actually is officially named Harold Doyle, which has a name that sounds very much like Harold Dahl, especially if you speak it with a Texas accent. And this one, it is this one that bears the resemblance to Chrisman. Standard Chrisman mugshot. Here again, walking in a different direction along Elm Street in Dallas. You notice this one, you can't even see it, and that's deliberate. Where's the damn button? This tramp right back here is hiding behind this guy. There are three tramps, but you can't see someone who is actually, this is the Chrisman figure, and the person behind him is had been identified as E. Howard Hunt, the Watergate burglar. God, if you do this, okay. If you twitch even a little, you're like 3 slides into that. According to one of the most well-known experts of the photographic evidence in the JFK assassination, a man named Robert Groden, a blow-up of this suggests that this tramp, the Hunt tramp, has a radio device, and there is something here, a radio device behind his ear. Another well-respected researcher, a man named L. Fletcher Prouty, who died not too long ago, argues that this man, this guy here, walking in the other direction of the tramps, is Edward Lansdale. Lansdale is a well-known figure in American history. He was a special assistant to Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge and a CIA OSS operative in Vietnam in the 1950s. In fact, he has been the subject of 2 film biographies. 1963's The Ugly American, where he's played by Marlon Brando, and that's based on a novel by William Lederer, and a very recent movie with Michael Caine called The Quiet American, based on a novel by Graham Greene, which basically has the Lansdale character working as a covert spy to help bring the U.S. into the Vietnam War. And that OSS connection is significant because Fred Chrisman's claim to have had a background with the OSS. Now, Prouty claimed that a blow-up of this photograph shows the Lansdale figure with a radio device behind his ear. So you got him walking that way, the other guy walking that way, with a coordinated kind of operation going on. Okay, so now what we're going to do is take a look at the Zapruder film. Okay, so I have to move over to this. And here we go again, the most studied film in the history of America. Oh, God, another piece of technology. I could never run a flying saucer, you know? I could barely get... There's a button. Is there a remote for this? It looks like there it is, okay. This can't be right. Okay, I'm going to try to do this without the remote.
First of the digital versions and is shown without the images between the sprocket holes. The framing is the standard format.
I am going to have to stop this. First thing I'd like to point out is the shot from the grassy knoll. Just to, you know, because you all know this. The shot's coming from here, it's hitting Kennedy in the head, and then you see it goes back. It's not from the book depository or anything like that. Okay?
So what are you showing now?
That was the grassy knoll shot. No magic.
This is a replay of the standard format version, this time in slow motion.
I'm sure there's a pause button on this. Can anybody tell me where the pause button is?
Looks like a ditto sign.
A what sign?
Ditto.
Ditto.
You're in the way.
Sorry. Still trying to figure out the equipment. I don't see a ditto sign. Can you show me? Is it the right?
TV.
That's for the TV. Sorry. Okay. Well, this gets replayed a few times. No magic bullet. I noticed that Arlen Specter is actually running for something around here. You all know that Arlen Specter is the author of the magic bullet theory. Yeah. No magic bullet theory. It's all bullshit. Okay. So again, the grassy knoll shot. There's the grassy knoll, and behind that is the rail
The
yard.
images between the
where,
sprocket holes could only be
Chrisman
seen
was
on
picked up.
slides of the original film. This is the first time that those images can be seen as part of a motion sequence.
Okay. There's more to be
Zapruder frame
seen here,
numbers
so
are
pay
also
attention.
displayed for research purposes.
I want to point out somebody after the Stemmons freeway sign right here. As soon as the car emerges, take a close look. Two people actually, but the one that's most interesting is the second one, this guy here. That guy is known as Radio Controller Man to Kennedy assassination researchers. The guy before him is the Umbrella Man. So the Radio Controller Man you can see from here, and you can see from other photographs of
This
this
is a
part.
replay with the images
We'll see it
between
again.
the sprocket holes.
That he's holding radio
This time
control device.
in slow motion.
Could you freeze the frame?
I would if I could figure out the equipment. But it plays many times, so we can look it over and over again. And you can see not only does he have a radio control device, he's coordinating the shots. Radio Controller Man? Okay, here we go. There's the sign, there's the Umbrella Man, and there's Radio Controller Man. Doing shoot from the Daltex building, shoot from the grassy knoll, and shoot from the book depository. All of it being coordinated by radio controlled signals. Now, I know it will upset a few people, but the driver doesn't do it.
This version tracks the
The
limousine
driver actually
and
slows
maintains
down the car,
President
though.
Kennedy and Governor Connolly at center frame. This version is only in slow motion.
There's a slow motion and close up. You can see William Greer is the driver. You can also, well, you tell me. There was also a 45 slug picked up on the other side of Elm Street. There are photographs of an FBI guy pick it up. So there's a 45 going on here somewhere, but it's not coming from William Greer.
This version zooms in on the image as much as possible without causing deterioration. President Kennedy is kept at center frame. This is only in slow motion.
Now, when he comes out from behind the Stemmons freeway sign, he's following the Umbrella Man, and there's some theories that he's shot actually in the throat with curare poison by the Umbrella Man himself, and he's paralyzed in that position, set up for the next shot. Okay.
These images, decades later,
Okay. If you could save the questions until I'm done. A little event. It demonstrates that no substitute teacher was called in for him at Rainier High School, supporting Chrisman's claim that he was teaching that day. Interesting, though, that although it covers a period from October 1st, 1963 to August 7th, 1964, it's all written in a single handwriting. In the aftermath of the life of Fred Chrisman, we come to this individual, a rather well-known figure among parapolitical researchers. This is Michael Riconosciuto, the son of one of Chrisman's business partners in Tacoma, someone named Marshall Riconosciuto. This is a photo that appeared in a Tacoma paper showing Michael as a boy of 12, a wunderkind who, at around this time, built his own argon laser that got him a job working for a Nobel Prize winner in laser physics, a scientist named Arthur Shalow. Remember that Chrisman himself had given this prescient description of a laser in his battle with the Daros in Burma, many years before the laser was invented. Rukona Shudo became much more widely known in the 1990s as the main informant to a writer named Danny Casolaro, and this involved his advanced technological skills. Casolaro was found dead in a West Virginia hotel room while investigating an international power cabal known as the Octopus. Rukona Shudo's role grew out of the modification he made to a super surveillance software used by this octopus called PROMIS, P-R-O-M-I-S. He did this as a part of something called the Cabazon-Wackenhut joint venture on a native reservation in Indio, California. At the time, a series of grisly murders accompanied what Rukona Shudo was doing, which also includes the development of shoulder-fired missiles and night vision goggles, and ultimately Rukona Shudo was convicted for running a methamphetamine lab, something for which he seems to have received an extraordinarily long sentence. All of this is the subject of a book that I wrote called The Octopus, for which I consider the Maury Island book a kind of prequel, as I said at the top of the lecture. A new edition of The Octopus just came out. I have copies of that one. And this one of my points and purposes here in taking this look at Maury Island is to establish that there are individuals and situations that operate in this covert conspiracy world over generations. In an interview I conducted with Michael Rukona Shudo exclusively about the Maury Island case, Rukona Shudo swore that Fred Chrisman wrote 1,600 pages of notes and a autobiography that have been tucked away in a storage somewhere. But Rukona Shudo is not going to say where, however, unless that information somehow gets him out of jail. So that's the whole thing with Rukona Shudo. What he says more or less serves this cause to try to get himself out of jail. So it may or may not exist. Okay, so I'll end this review of the history of Maury Island by reviewing the various theories about it. The first to dismiss is the one I think favored actually by well-known paranormal writer John Keel for Roswell, that the Maury Island saucers were actually the Japanese fugal balloons. And as I mentioned, time refutes this idea since the fugal balloons went up in '45, and it is not likely to have stayed aloft for 2 years. It is interesting, though, that the fugal explanation was also used by Guy Bannister for the retrieved 30-inch saucer that he encountered. And again, the time factor rules that out, but it does tell us that the saucer wasn't what Bannister originally said it was, that it was a hoax perpetuated by teenagers. So Bannister admits to the lie. And just as with Roswell, presents another lie. And the biggest explanation of Maury Island is that the one most accepted by most people is that it was a hoax, that Harold Dahl started this one first it's Harold Dahl himself who started this idea that that the thing was a hoax by claiming that it was a hoax. But any review of the history, as I pointed out, shows that he made this claim after a long streak of problems that developed in his personal life after he was told to keep quiet about it. So that's the whole thing with the hoax idea carried on due to the absence now of any piece of the retrieved material from the flying disc. And also the insistence of his wife. You know, after his wife got sick, his son disappeared, his wife said, you know, you got to do something about this, and Harold Dahl began to call it a hoax. The pieces of the debris that were in the possession of Dahl and Chrisman disappeared in the crash of the Davidson and Brown plane. The pieces that Arnold had were turned over to Colonel Sander, and the last that he and Amos Smith saw of them were in the back of Sanders' car. This is what Arnold reports in his book, The Coming of the Saucers, and what Smith told the FBI. Arnold later made the claim that the film he took from that period was stolen along with his camera, as I said, in 1977. We have, however, seen the photographs that appeared in the Tacoma papers and in the FBI reports. But of course, all of that could have just been smelter slag. So what purpose would a hoax serve? Arnold had his own sighting story that brought him all the publicity he wanted, so he didn't need to perpetuate a hoax. Dahl quickly went quiet about it, and Chrisman disappeared also. The Air Force never conducted a thorough investigation of the David Brown crash and never officially concluded that that was a hoax. John Keel came to believe that the hoax was perpetrated to cover up radioactive waste dumping from the nearby Hanford nuclear plant. Chrisman did indeed get a job at the Hanford plant after Maury Island, so this theory posits that this was a reward for muddying up the waters of Dahl and his crew actually witnessing this radioactive dumping. There is a researcher named Ron Halberter, though, who refutes this idea basically by looking at a map and the geography of the region. And it seems pretty clear from that when you look at it that any radioactive waste dumping would have taken place actually farther to the south, down the Columbia River, and not up north near Puget Sound. The heck is that?
So you better get down.
Check. You never saw that before.
Okay. Ron Halberter, by the way, who's probably the most thorough Maury Island researcher I've ever encountered, is also someone who has been off the radar screen for a number of years. He argues then for the unified saucer theory concerning the summer of 1947, that the Maury Island saucers were indeed extraterrestrial, that Arnold saw the same group, and that the central malfunctioning craft is the one that crashed at Roswell. That's pure speculation, of course, but we have several other connecting threads to Roswell. Phil Corso, for one, who mentions the Foreign Technologies Desk. And Corso, again, was an investigator for the Warren Commission, so we have a link there to the Kennedy assassination. Recently, there was an Air Force sergeant named Robert Vinson who came forward with his story of hitching a ride on an unmarked C-54 that stopped in Dallas on November 22nd and then flew to Roswell. So we got another Kennedy link there. Continuing along the extraterrestrial theory, it has been suggested that Chrisman did indeed hold on to the crash retrieval material and that he used it to blackmail himself into some of the choice assignments in the covert world. He sabotaged Brown and Davidson's plane to keep it out of the hands of the Air Force intelligence and under his exclusive control, and the lack of a real investigation into that crash tends to support this. Certainly these themes of being a CIA agent and his background with the OSS seem to suggest something of this sort. And of course the Kennedy assassination would be one of those choice assignments. The Woods MJ-12 document, referring to Clay Shaw, ties together the nuclear and the UFO theories by suggesting that the Maury Island UFOs contain nuclear reactors. And Michael Riconosciuto makes the claim in the interview appendix to the Maury Island book that Chrisman was actually attached to a military project involving radioactive discs designed to cloud the film of aerial surveillance platforms, a radar clouding device. And this, of course, fits into Jim Garrison's idea that Chrisman worked in aerospace espionage. It is very difficult to conceive that every document that I have presented here and all the research compiled in the Maury Island UFO book is the product of an elaborate hoax. It would be a hoax perpetuated by a large number of people with an extremely advanced knowledge not only of history, but of the very specialized history of ufology and the separate specialized history of the Kennedy assassination. Even though this kind of thinking is often laid at the feet of conspiracy theorists, common sense actually rules in parapolitical research, and common sense dictates that this would be very difficult for every aspect of the Maury Island story to have been hoaxed. The Maury Island book, the only one to take a close look at this history, was published in 1996, and since then its publisher died under very unusual circumstances. And also since that time, many research tributaries have arisen. These include locating and doing oral history interviews with people like Emil Smith and another of Chrisman's partner, a man named Tom Beckham, who apparently is still alive, locating Fred Chrisman's 1,600-page memoir, and doing further Freedom of Information Act requests on various ancillary people connected to the case, all of which takes more money and resources than can typically be devoted to it. What the case needs is a patron and a new publisher for a new edition, and I'm certainly willing to listen to anyone who wants to carry on the research in that way. I'm going to stop that. just leave it there. On the day of his death, let's get some picture up. Well, now we get the whole. Just put it back to that picture of the cover of the book. And I'll leave that there. Yeah, the bottom one. Okay, on the day of his death, John F. Kennedy gave one final speech, and it involved the defense contract for the TFX tactical fighter. This was an extremely controversial contract that everyone expected to go to Boeing. Instead, how far back should I go with that? Let's go. This was an extremely controversial contract. The TFX tactical fighter was expected to go to Boeing, and instead JFK awarded it to General Dynamics. So you could certainly add Boeing to the list of people and groups that might have wanted Kennedy dead, and Garrison, of course, said that Chrisman worked for Boeing. More importantly, however, the TFX tactical fighter eventually became the F-111 and was a project that was eventually sold to Australia. And if you look at some of the parapolitical research into this, you find that many people seem to think that this is what opened the funding corridor to the Australians in their development of the Pine Gap listening post for the Echelon satellites. Pine Gap, of course, is the Australian Area 51. All this is outside the scope of this talk, but we have an established biography of Lee Harvey Oswald as a spy connected to Area 51 through his connection to the U-2 spy plane that was developed there. We also have a recent LBJ Did It book written actually by the father of the current White House press secretary, Barr McClellan, that connects Johnson's role in the assassination to Ed Clark, who is the ambassador of Australia. So the last thing you would want to do with all this information, whether you believe the extraterrestrial aspect of this or not, whether you believe it in conspiracies or not, you really can't dismiss it as anything less than an important and only dimly understood episode in American history. One that continues to illuminate what we know and understand about the current world situation, the militarization of space, and the role that the intelligence world has had in manipulating ufological reality and national politics. And that's it. Okay, just a second. So, Pat, we have two things on the agenda.
Yeah.
Take questions and answers about this lecture and then go on to the best of Steam Shovel Press, or we may be running so late now that we can do neither of these things.
No, we can take some questions and answers, and then we can
Okay.
take a break and
Go to the other, okay.
press.
All right, let's start from the front.
You just made your last statement about that the clock which said Johnson was partly responsible for
Absolutely.
JFK. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. Well, again, the point I was making is that the White House press secretary now, the guy that replaced Ari Fleischer, it's his father who wrote the latest LBJ Did It book. And you can see in the NASA Nazis and JFK book, there's a famous photograph called the Wink photograph. After Johnson is sworn in, oh, by the way, Johnson was sworn in on a catechism. They didn't have a Bible, so that means he never really was president. But a Catholic instructional book. But he looks after it happens. He looks over at Albert Thomas, who was the guy responsible. He was on the Ways and Means Committee. He was responsible for the funding of NASA. Thomas winks at him. But the real proof of all of this, is a fingerprint at the book depository, which just a few years ago was established to belong to Mac Wallace. Mac Wallace was a guy that is well known that Johnson had used to do away with his enemies. Somebody dating his sister, for instance, was killed by Mac Wallace. Somebody investigating the Bobby Baker scandal, which was threatening to break at the time Johnson was on the ticket, would have ruined his career. The government official set out to investigate that, was murdered by Mac Wallace, and Mac Wallace's fingerprint has been found at the book depository. So you don't get evidence that's harder than that. Also, Madeline Brown, Johnson's mistress, who recently died. She claimed that Johnson came home after a meeting one night and said, after tomorrow we won't have to worry about the damn Kennedy brothers.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You know what I heard in one of the books? that Johnson, 6 months before he became president, he had his dinner with engraved or something that would be president or something like that.
Yeah. Well, you hear a lot of stories like that.
What?
But probably the biggest proof is the turnaround of Kennedy was de-escalating the war in Vietnam. And the day after he died, Johnson turned that around. And that gave us the big Vietnam War, which was a boondoggle to military contractors, hardware people, Bell and Howell helicopters.
One thing I think will just blow your mind, there was a speaker where his mother was the person who wrote about how many people were going to go into the draft or something. And the day when Johnson became president, they came down and said, now all these people will go to the, are being drafted. And she was shocked because the draft was supposed to end. And they actually had like 53,000 people will die in Vietnam before the war even started. And that's exactly how many people died.
Yeah.
I mean, like they want to get rid of people so they...
Well, they want to get rid of people so they can sell more military hardware. It's the same situation that we have in the wars in the Middle East. The people that we go over there basically to exploit the oil. The people that use the oil the most it's the military, the tanks, and the military over there. So basically go into war to perpetuate war. George.
Regarding the connection between Clay Shaw and Maury Island, is there anything other than the document by Robert and Ryan Wood?
Yes, of course there is. I put it up there. The original letter that Garrison discovered, supposedly Chrisman, from 1968, mentions that Chrisman was the first person that Clay Shaw called when he discovered that Garrison was investigating him.
No, but to Maury Island. You had I thought...
Well, there's the connection to Chrisman, who's connected to Maury Island.
Okay.
Oh, you mean turning over the fragments?
Yeah.
No, there's not separate documentary evidence there for that, as far as I know.
Ken,
Mike.
The photo of the three tramps
Yes.
arrested at Dealey Plaza. It's the third guy in the back seems to resemble Chrisman more than the one that some people claim is Chrisman. The first.
Yes. Well, I mean.
In age and everything else.
Well, that one is supposedly Hunt, but I don't. My opinion is that the first one looks a lot more. I mean, it's got the hairline of Chrisman. Hunt. You mean the guy with the hat?
Yeah, considering the fact that this is almost 20 years later and the aging of it.
But the hairline wouldn't change. But of course, the hat would obscure the hairline. Yeah. Well. Yeah. Could be. Yes.
Something I read recently about a bullet that hit the windshield from the front. The drain, perhaps.
Oh, right. Yeah. Many people believe that somebody came out of the drain. I've actually stood in that drain. I think it's covered up now.
About the windshield actually.
The windshield did have a bullet wound that was not
attributable to anything else.
Yeah, the Warren Commission couldn't come to a conclusion about it.
Plus, the curb there got hit too. Guy.
Tague, yeah, was hit in the cheek by. Yeah. James Tague. Yeah.
All right. So there are two very significant events that you've been discussing. What is the UFO Kennedy assassination connection? Because there seems to be a very strong connection between UFOs and the John F. Kennedy assassination.
I think I just did a 2-hour lecture about that.
But I mean, from what I understand is that John F. Kennedy did have some knowledge about UFOs and extraterrestrials. And according, I'm just talking about rumors because I don't have proof of anything, that John F. Kennedy had an affair with Marilyn Monroe, and he whispered in what they call pillow talk information about UFOs and
You're talking about something called the Spiriglio document, which actually is a transcript of a conversation, supposedly is a transcript of a conversation between the newspaper columnist Dorothy Kilgallen and a friend of hers named Howard Feinstein, in which she is saying that Marilyn's been going around to all these parties telling people that Kennedy took her out to a desert base to see, quote, the things from outer space.
Area 51.
Well, it doesn't mention Area 51. They just call it the desert base. The desert base actually has been known for a long time. There's a 7 Days in May is a movie about a right-wing takeover of the government run from a desert base. The other day, actually, I was watching a movie, The Three Stooges in Orbit, in And I kid you not, they've got it. There's a device that there's a vehicle, a kind of a flying saucer that's a tank and a helicopter and a submarine, and they're driving through the Nevada desert, and they actually knock over the famous sign that you always see, restricted area. This is 1962.
So, but the John F. Kennedy assassination and UFO connection, is that significant that John F. Kennedy had knowledge about UFOs and extraterrestrials and was assassinated because of his knowledge and that he wanted this information to be exposed? Is that a significant part of the Kennedy assassination connection to what you're showing here, flying saucers from other planets?
Well, I don't have any documentation to that effect.
I mean, but
yeah.
let's call theoretically.
Well, the story that says Stanton Friedman recounts it is that the astronomer Don Menzel was the back channel for MJ-12 to get information to JFK, and there's some suggestion in the papers of Don Menzel that this is the case. We know that MJ-12 was an actual group, and so we don't know how successful that Menzel. Because by 1963, they've been dealing with these aliens in '47. They cut the president out of the loop by then. And the only way the president could get any information would be through a back channel. But that's just speculation.
But I mean, in this lecture, there appears to be a definite connection between the John F. Kennedy assassination and UFOs.
Well, the biggest thing is the funding of Pine Gap, and the fact that Oswald was a spy connected to Area 51.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
So I mean.
Yeah. If to give you the short of that is that Oswald served in Atsugi, Japan, where the U-2s flew out of. He spent a period of time in the Soviet Union, the precise point of time where they got the information to shoot down Gary Powers' U-2. He had a job, before he got the job at the book depository, he worked for a photographic firm called Jagger Child Stovall, which processed U-2 film. So throughout his career, Lee Harvey Oswald was a spy connected to the U-2 program, and the U-2 was developed at Area 51.
Ah.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Have you possibly considering a situation of a group, possibly a group of ETs, Nordic, that researchers nobody knows about, but that the aliens that have been talked about in the past, Nordic, they're like the Nordic people, Greys, so forth, know, but it's kept secret about them. That type of conspiracy. Government M12, which is only on 4, they know about them, but they're kept secret.
Well, it's hard to really know how many secrets are being kept, and if they're really good about it, then I couldn't tell you. But it's certainly possible that there's another group of aliens that nobody knows about.
Right.
That yeah.
The general pattern everyone knows about, like Greys, Nordic, et cetera.
Yeah.
The one group that may not, separate from that.
Yeah, I certainly.
The other half, maybe the other group knows about them, but.
I certainly can see the possibility.
You have Sheridan contactees. They talk about the Fleet and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Back there.
It appears that you have too many players in the Maury Island conspiracy to make any total sense of the whole scenario.
Who would you cut out then? Who would you cut out?
Well, I don't know who I would cut out. It just seems like it seems like you've done a lot of extensive research, in reference to it, and consequently there's a lot of players that keep on repeating themselves in other scenarios down the line.
Yeah, the thing that's framing your thinking is something akin to Oswald acted alone. The argument I'm making is that these are multi-generational bureaucratic police agencies that function in the real world as conspiracy bureaucracies, not necessarily 1 or 2 or 3 or 1,000 different people, but various bureaucracies acting to protect themselves and to extend their own power.
Well, it just seems like, that may be, that may very well be, but it seems like they select the same people over and over and over again. Obviously, they have more people to select than these.
Well, we're also talking about far more projects that they do. That's why it becomes historically interesting when you start seeing the same people. But we're just talking about the Kennedy assassination and the Maury Island case. I'm sure you could find different people threaded through different other projects that are, that are subjects of other lectures or other study. That's what makes the case interesting, that there are these coincidences. But you can't dismiss them as it's just a coincidence that Guy Bannister and Jim Garrison were in the Pacific Northwest, and then they were also... Yeah, so I'm just saying it's just more common sense to suggest that these people were working together than not.
What information do you have about, there are photographs that document that in July 1952, UFOs invaded Washington, D.C. And then supposedly, according to theories, that the reason for this obvious invasion, with thousands of people could see UFOs invading Washington, D.C., that allegedly an extraterrestrial group approached the United States secret government to make some kind of a treaty. Do you have any information that there was really some kind of agreement or treaty between an extraterrestrial group and the United States government?
Shortly thereafter, after the great sighting of 52, supposedly Eisenhower met with a representative of the extraterrestrials. Now this is all speculation, it's all science fiction, except for the fact that a psychologist named Wilhelm Reich also had his encounters with UFOs, and he claimed that he indeed had a meeting with Eisenhower as well. And there is proof in Eisenhower's diary that he left to go see a dentist one day, and it didn't make any sense, but that's the precise day that he supposedly met with Wilhelm Reich. And then after that time, Reich, and it's been suggested that this is a reflection of Reich's dementia, but he said that Eisenhower was protecting him and his work and his cloudbuster fights against the UFOs. And the document that I was telling you about, that is the smoking gun proof of MJ-12, the Cutler Twining, intersects with a document called the Lou Douglas Memo, in which they are arranging a meeting to study what Wilhelm Reich was doing out in the desert. So the Cutler Twining Memo says that we have to postpone a meeting so that we can discuss a special studies group of MJ-12. So that's why I say that's why I declare that that's the smoking gun, because those two documents are found years apart in archives that are totally separate, one in Texas and one in D.C. And it's, so I mean, that's when I talk about these things, I mean, you can speculate anything you want, but because I'm a documentary historian, I can only give you the things that there's some actual documents.
So there appears to be some Wilhelm Reich extraterrestrial connection.
Oh, absolutely. Reich's last book, Contact with Space, describes his trip through Roswell, New Mexico. That was like in 1955, which belies the idea that people lost all interest in Roswell until the 1980s.
And was there a Von Tassel extraterrestrial connection?
George Van Tassel, yeah, he created the Integratron, yeah.
Can you comment a little on the downing of that B-25 and what the significance was in terms of the sighting that had occurred earlier? And even though you didn't really go into it, probably that's because you don't have any hard evidence to give any explanation for why that went down. Any kind of theory or any speculation that you've come across that might explain what the significance of that was?
That was the end. Yeah, that was the end of the. I thought I explained that. That was the end of the trail of the debris. They had Chrisman had given them this debris, which, was something different than what Arnold made the ashtray out of. But then the crash happened, and after that they never recovered the debris. That's the significance. And it's a possibility that Chrisman sabotaged that plane and held on to the stuff himself. And according to this line of thought, he used his control. He has extraterrestrial material, and he can expose it to the world. But instead of exposing it to the world, he secured his position as a covert operative. That's that line of thought. I don't say that's what I believe, but I can understand.
Was Chrisman and all these other characters, are they still around, or have they?
Chrisman died in '75. Dahl died in 1980.
Under unusual circumstances?
Chrisman died of. It's interesting. Chrisman died of kidney failure, and while he was in the hospital, he read, we were talking about this before, it must have been Betty and Barney Hill, but he read some abduction book, and he thought in his last days, he thought that he was being abducted, and when he was in the hospital surrounded by medical technicians. Yeah, so it wasn't any more mysterious than kidney failure. Yes?
When you say that Chrisman wielded his power if he kept all this material, what does he do? Blackmail the U.S. government? I mean, for his, you say, to get these covert positions.
Yes.
He blackmailed the government.
Yeah.
Oh.
You don't think that's possible?
Oh, sure.
Stay alive.
Yeah.
So the theory about why John F. Kennedy was one theory why John F. Kennedy was assassinated is that he knew too much about UFOs and extraterrestrial connections to the secret government. Is that one theory that you have?
It's a theory, but it's weak.
Well, weak?
It's weak, yeah. It's weak. It has more to do with things more complicated than, I mean, it may be part of it, but the point that this whole story makes is that it had to do with the way he was trying to manipulate aerospace industry. And in the long run, it had more to do, this TFX tactical fighter set up the whole apparatus by which they eventually developed Pine Gap, again, which was the Australian Area 51. So we are today living in a kind of a science fiction nightmare where we have things like Area 51 and Pine Gap and the Echelon satellite system. So it's not just a matter of knocking off a few aliens, and because JFK doesn't want to tell people that, we're going to knock him off too. It's a question. Kennedy had to die as part of this whole global setup.
So it had nothing to do with that he knew too much about something?
Not according to this line of thought. It's more that he gave the contract that was supposed to go to Boeing to General Dynamics. So that's set into motion. I'm not saying specifically that Boeing was the primarily responsible for the assassination, but they were a chief element in the military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower identified right before he retired. And so that set into motion everything that industrial aerospace and the military needed to get the war in Vietnam up and running so that they could, create military hardware and make a huge amount of money for weapons contractors.
Wasn't there a suspicion that perhaps the Mafia was in on the shooting?
The problem with that theory is that the Mafia couldn't conduct a cover-up over 40 years. So the CIA, the intelligence community uses Mafia people, hitmen, and they pays them off. But the bigger picture is that the Mafia, it may have been a Mafia triggerman, although I don't really think that's true. I don't think Chrisman worked for the Mafia. But the whole project, including the cover-up, had to be something different because the Mafia doesn't do cover-ups. Yes.
One of the pictures I'd seen recently was something, a still photo, I guess, of somebody took a picture of the grassy knoll from across the street, and they showed the outline of somebody with a rifle.
This is the Mormon photograph, and you see the blast kind of coming at you.
Yeah.
Well, an interesting thing about that is that some researchers say that you can see a name tag on the guy.
Yeah.
I just can't imagine. I was going to shoot the president.
The guy was wearing a uniform, and that's why he wasn't stopped, because he just quietly closed up everything and walked off, and he thought he was a cop or something.
Yeah. Oh, and there were a lot of people around at the Plaza who said that they were Secret Service people, that they were FBI, that they were cops, and all that kind of stuff. It's called a Mormon photograph.
Yeah, because there was somebody, I think, was walking, and he reported about a guy who was walking away from the scene.
Well, there was in one of those Men Who Killed Kennedy specials, I talked to some guy who breaks down crying when he describes that this shot came across over his shoulder. Yeah, that's supposedly the same guy. Yeah.
There were so many people that were killed from it.
Yeah, the Kennedy Assassination Witness List. Yeah, the long list of witnesses. Another great series of coincidences. Yeah.
And every one of those was very different. But same.
All connected by connection to the Kennedy assassination. Yeah.
So you're saying that this Kennedy assassination was all just about business and money, had nothing to do with extraterrestrials, galactic politics?
This is the third time.
Well, all of that would be about money and power too, wouldn't it?
This is the third time.
Well, beyond planet Earth, I'm talking about.
But you don't think they have power and money beyond planet Earth?
Yeah, well, their currency is different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
All right.
okay.
That was great.
Sure. Thanks, Ben.
Steam Shovel Press Magazine. All right, Ken, welcome to the conference.
Okay, thanks, Pat. Haven't we done this before?
Yes, sir.
Deja vu all over again. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. The seats are kind of open in the front if you want to get closer.
Yes. Double right click to advance. Double scroll wheel
Okay, this is not going to be as scripted as the other one. This is the point and purpose of this is the best of Steam Shovel Press, which is vague enough to cover a lot of different topics. I'm just going to go on. If you have questions, I know there's some people interested in the octopus. I'll present a few things and then just take questions. And we'll go on for as long as everybody wants to. It seems to be a dwindling crowd. Anyway, so the first thing I want to cover actually is an article in progress. Tom, how do we get it up there?
It's coming up.
Okay. Is Frank here? Good. Frank's gone, so I can totally misrepresent this. Frank, Frank is a Mason, and what I'm working on right now has to do with Masons.
Boy, they in trouble.
Yellow.
Yeah, they sure are.
Searching for a signal.
Pretty sure. I sent the signal.
Here's another good conspiracy theory for you.
What? How computers don't work?
No, high Masons.
Yes. Well, yeah.
Over though was it 44th?
Yeah. Well, according to the Masons, there are only 3. And in fact, when the cops give you the 3rd degree, where do you suppose that comes from? And also, they use the Carpenter's square as one of their symbols. So when people are on the square, they're straight shooters, like the Masons would like to consider themselves. Yeah. So people are familiar with this kind of imagery. This is the symbol of the Masons. The famous handshake. The G means God. Although supposedly the Masons are deists, they're not Christian. It's not a Christian group. And here's an important symbol, the eye in the pyramid. That's a ubiquitous symbol. This is the new nickel. I'm surprised at the order of these things. This is I'm sorry, Lewis and Clark. Have you seen the new nickels? Do you realize that there are new nickels now, right? Some people didn't even know that was the case. They changed the back of the nickel. Okay? This is Lewis and Clark, both of whom were Masons. And here they are doing the Mason handshake in the most recent coin that we have coined.
Double.
Yeah, okay. This is the painting of Lewis and Clark. There are conspiracies involving the death of Meriwether Lewis. In fact, he committed suicide, but the different historical sources make it out that he was actually killed, perhaps, by agents of Thomas Jefferson.
What did Thomas Jefferson have against him?
It's a complicated story. It all has to do with a Spanish spy that Lewis was trying to expose, who was a Mason also. So it's all this internecine warfare between Masons. And the relevance in modern times will be coming up in a minute. Does anybody know what this is? This is connected to the octopus. This was the Total Information Awareness Office that John Poindexter formed as part of the current administration, the Bush administration. Part of DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research, I don't know what the PA stands for, but these are the people that invented the internet. But also this John Poindexter was forced to resign because he was trying to create a way of taking advantage of the stock market after terrorist events would happen. And when this was exposed, Poindexter was forced to resign. But again, you get the symbol. And Poindexter was a man that Casillero studied, the guy in the octopus. So that's why there's a connection. And this hung on the guy's office. And you got the eye in the pyramid. Total Information Awareness Office. Hello. Okay. This is something. How do I stop that, Tom?
What happened to the days of slide projectors?
Long gone. This is the digital age, my friend.
I still got a
Yeah.
slide projector.
Left click gets rid of it.
Left
if you get
click,
that
okay.
again, but
All right.
remember to do doubles.
Okay, here, this is called sixfigurejobs.com. And you'll notice, which is just a group of very wealthy executives in San Francisco. This appeared in an ad in San Francisco, where you're supposed to send them your resume if you want to get a six-figure job. And if your resume matches up with what they want, again, rich elites, what the rich elites want from you, then they will work for you to find a six-figure job. So again, the eye in the pyramid. These are small. I'm sorry. This is like the first time I've done these, and I got to get them larger. Fidelity Investments. Maybe some of you work with this firm. You can't see it so well. It's the eye in the pyramid.
Try rolling the scroll wheel.
Rolling it.
Yeah, roll it.
There you go.
Hey, good for you.
Excellent, excellent. And to go back one is one on the left.
If you roll the other way, it'll.
Well, to go back to the previous image.
Double scroll.
Double scroll.
Click the scroll wheel twice.
Okay.
Click it twice.
Click it. Just push
Yeah,
down on it.
Push down on it.
There we go. I wanted to make this bigger so people can see. The eye in the pyramid. And these are just yuppies. Fidelity. There's William Clark. Meriwether Lewis. Again, I'm only beginning to work on this for an article for the 14 Times. George Washington, a Mason. You know, see down here we have the, we have G there, the god, and we've got the Builder's Square and the sextant, I guess. All of these things, the trowel, all this stuff represents some kind of symbolic meaning. Again, it's deism, it's non-Christian. You know, our founding father. Okay, does everybody know about this?
No.
Do you know what this is? It's a $20 bill. It's a $20 bill, and if you fold it the correct way, you've got the trade towers. This is the Pentagon going up in smoke. The Pentagon, and then 9/11. If I can get rid of that thing. And I can show you how to fold it. I mean, this is great for bars. You know. And of course, the dollar bill is full of all the Masonic symbolism. Novus Ordo Seclorum and all that business. In fact, here we have it. Okay, so anyway, that's some Masonic imagery. The reason it's interesting to me is that there's recently been a resurgence of strange Masonic activity. The first happened in Istanbul. Terror bombers invaded a Masonic lodge and killed a bunch of people. These were the same people that later took credit for the Madrid bombings. And then of course they said America was next. And then shortly after that, there was a Masonic killing in America, in New York actually, in Patchogue. How do you pronounce that? Patchogue. Yeah, there was a killing in Patchogue that had to do with Masonic rituals. And apparently Al Qaeda is at war. The Masons are the Crusaders, and Al Qaeda is at war with Masonry. Anyway, that's just that. That's just part of.
What are you saying is Al Qaeda is Mason?
No, it's anti-Mason. They are the people. I can tell you the specific group. The Jund al-Quds, also known as the Soldiers of Jerusalem, are an Al Qaeda squad that was responsible for the attacks in the Masonic lodge in Istanbul. This is a quote from them. All the Masons would have been killed, but there was a technical fault. So, because God wished it, only 3 were killed. These are the same people that take responsibility for the Madrid bombings. So, I mean, I don't know what all that means. This is an article in progress. Okay.
What was the Al-Qaeda the Masons are?
This is what I'm investigating. I can't give you the answer. This is, like I said, a work in progress. This is all kind of extemporaneous. This is not a prepared talk. It's just, I thought I'd share with you some of the things that...
Because it's crackling, there's many people here now.
Yeah.
So you can tell us all you know.
Okay, so I noticed of the books that I have remaining, I've got this one, the Mind Control, Oswald and JFK. This gives me an opportunity to talk about mind control technology in the Kennedy assassination. Oswald spent a period of time in Minsk, and he went in for a supposed adenoid operation. And the argument of this book, a lot of this book is a reprint of a book that came out in, shortly after the Kennedy assassination. But it has all my add-on value. The photographs and the introductory comments are all by me. And the book originally argued that there was a technology called RHIC/EDOM, and that means radio hypnotic intercerebral control of the brain and the electronic dissolution of memory. And it is based on technology developed by a guy named Jose Delgado. Now, Delgado was on the front page of the New York Times. I think this is in like 1965, yeah. And he had this bull charge him. He's the bull charging at him. He pressed something called the stemoceiver and stopped the bull in its tracks. It was an electronic mind control device. We're not talking about hypnosis or drugs. We're talking about electronic devices. And one of the operating conspiracy ideas about Oswald is that he had the same thing. He had an implant. So the obvious question here is, now mind control supposedly affects people's behavior. It makes people do things. But EDOM and RHIC actually is a technology that stops people from doing things. So this fits perfectly into what most people accept about the Kennedy assassination, that Oswald didn't do a thing. So if he was in the book depository and he had this implant, press a button and they stopped him. So that's the big thrust of this book. Also, this is the one, I don't know, I think we were talking about it. This book has a copy of, I will show it, if I can find it. The Spiriglio document. Now this is the document I was talking about before that is a transcript of a conversation between Dorothy Kilgallen and Howard, I tried to contact this guy too, Howard Rothberg, and in which she says that there's a transcript of a conversations, pillow talk basically, between Marilyn Monroe and JFK, and that Marilyn's going around to all these parties in Hollywood saying that JFK took her out to the desert base to show her the things from outer space. And this is dated one day before Marilyn Monroe died. Now that's going to be kind of important because part of what I want to show you is a meteor reaction to conspiracy ideas. And I'm going to put on a television show called Conspiracy Zone, in which we do discussion of Marilyn Monroe, and it's kind of funny, but it touches on issues. You will see that there are three theories put forth. My argument is that she was killed by MJ-12, which is probably the wackiest theory out there, but I was the only person to bring documentation.
Dorothy Kilgallen supposedly killed?
Yes. Now Dorothy Kilgallen officially died of alcohol and barbiturate poisoning, but I have a tip, I wish I would have brought it, of her appearance on What's My Line that very night. And she wins the game, and she's totally sober and totally bright, and there's no suggestion there that, at least there, anything could have happened after that. But the reason for her death was because she had interviewed Jack Ruby, and there was a transcript of that. And when she died, was I explaining this to you? Somebody. When she died, the transcript was passed on to Jane Mansfield. And Jane Mansfield had this Ruby transcript until, again, according to the lore, the CIA actually hired Anton LaVey, the head of the Church of Satan, to put a curse on her. And then Jane Mansfield was decapitated in an auto accident. And that's the end of the trail for that Ruby transcript. And also, after Kilgallen died, and I have this is also on this What's My Line tape, the very next show, they discuss they discuss Dorothy Kilgallen passing, and they do what she would want them to do. They play the game, but then in the course of the game, they talk about the blackout, the great northeastern blackout, happened right after Dorothy Kilgallen died, and there was a big flying saucer wave at that point, a lot of UFO activity. And Kilgallen had been writing actually about flying saucers since like 1955. And at one point, she even discussed Wilhelm Reich's Cloudbuster gun. And so that's another story.
Well,
So
what do they say the blackout was caused by?
flying saucers.
What?
Flying saucers. I don't know. They don't really. I don't know what the official explanation is.
Was there something up the pine bush though?
What's that?
Was there a flying saucer or something up? Oh.
Let me get her. And I'll get back to you. Yes.
Could you say more about the satanic cult?
Well, this was Anton LaVey, and I was just discussing his role in the Dorothy Kilgallen thing. I mean, there's a lot to be said about satanic cults. There's a guy named Michael Aquino who works for the Pentagon, basically, who is the head of the Temple of Set, which is like an offshoot of the Satanic Church, and he was being investigated by the matron saint of all conspiracy researchers, a woman named Mae Brussel. And in the course of her investigation, she died of a fast-acting cancer.